Have you ever looked at the Monterey Screensaver and thought, wow, that looks so cool? Well, today I'll be showing you how to make a similar shader in Reality Composer Pro using the node system in the new shader graph. This is what we'll be creating. It's a shader that colors a surface with a gradient based on the distance that the surface is from the camera. The colors are inspired by the Monterey Screensaver for macOS. I think it's a good project to get you thinking about the different ways you can use custom shaders for creative purposes, instead of, or to augment, a physically accurate reality-based look for your 3D objects. I've been playing around with Reality Composer Pro since the visionOS beta came out last week, and while there are some small gotchas you need to consider since it's in beta, I'm mostly just really impressed with what you can do in the shader graph. It's such an approachable tool for anybody that's worked in a node-based renderer, so you can come in and start playing around. If you want a complete beginner's overview of getting started in Reality Composer Pro and working with nodes and shaders, please check out my Medium post, which I've linked in the notes below. Or check out the Explore Materials in Reality Composer Pro session video from WWDC. Again, the link will be in the description below. Alright, let's dive in. In this first part, we'll go over how to utilize position data to color an object. Launch Reality Composer Pro and create a new project. Add a cube to your scene. Go up to Insert Object. This will launch an asset browser. Double-click the cube and it will be added to your scene at the origin. Now we'll go ahead and get rid of the default material, and our cube will take on this pink-purple look, indicating it doesn't have a material assigned. Let's also make the cube sized to 1 so that we can normalize the scale as we start to color the cube. This will make the cube 5 times larger, so you may need to pull back to be able to see it. Okay, let's also raise the cube up 50 centimeters so it's sitting perfectly on the XZ plane. Okay, now we're done setting up our geometry. Let's go ahead and start work on the material. Add a new custom material by clicking the plus and going to Materials Custom. Now with the material selected, open the shader graph. Oh, and it's always good to rename stuff as you go, so to go ahead and rename your material as you see fit. I'll just call mine cube material. Great, now let's turn our attention to the shader graph. We're going to make an unlit surface material so we can get rid of the default material XPBR surface node. There are 2 main ways to add nodes to the shader graph. You can click the plus new node button or just double click anywhere in the shader graph. Let's add our base surface material node by clicking the new node button and searching for unlit. Now let's connect the unlit surface node to the custom surface input on the outputs node. And you'll notice nothing happens. That's because we need to assign our material to our cube geometry. Click the cube in the hierarchy and in material bindings, choose our new material. Great, now our cube has a flat gray color. Awesome, but kind of boring. So let's do something a little more interesting. We'll visualize the positions on the cube by having the position drive the color of our material. So let's add a position node. We're going to eventually want our shader to use the world space position data. However, there's currently a bug in Reality Composer Pro where we can't use world space directly on our position node. The workaround is to set the space to model and transform the model position to world position. Luckily, there's a transform vector node that does exactly that. Connect the position node to the input on the transform vector node, and then edit the transform vector node so it converts from model to world space. Perfect. Let's make a little room for a graph here. Next, we need to do a bit of setup for proper type conversion. Because the vector we receive is a vector 3, and eventually we'll want this data to drive the color information, which expects a color 3 type, we need to convert from one data type to another. One way to do this is to separate the vector 3 into 3 separate floats, one for each dimension, and then recombine the 3 floats back into a color 3 type. This will also be handy because we're going to want to work with the different dimensions and color channels separately anyways. So add a separate 3 node and connect the transformed vector into the separate 3 node. And then add a connect 3 node and connect it to the color input on the unlit surface node. You'll notice it goes black because we're essentially feeding it 3 floats with a value of 0 for each color channel. And since they're all set to 0, the resultant color is black. Now we'll finally start to see some color. Connect the outputs of your separate 3 node into the inputs of the combine 3 node. Color. If you've done any kind of work with shaders or renderers, you'll recognize these colors. But essentially what's happening is the X position is driving the red color, the Y position is driving the green color, and the Z position is driving the blue color. Because the coordinates of the edges of our cube are going from -0.5 to +0.5, we're seeing that any value below 0 is black, and the brightest the color ever gets is a 50% gray. Let's normalize these values so that all the colors are going from 0 to 1 instead. We can do this for all three values of our position vector 3 at one time by adding a single remap node. Set the three channels to have a low in value of -0.5 and a high in value of 0.5. Great, now we have our pretty color spectrum going from 0 to 1, or black to white, mapped out on the surface of our cube. One last thing to know is that by default surfaces, even unlit surfaces like this, have tone mapping turned on, which is why the brightest point doesn't look full white. To address this, go back to our unlit surface node and uncheck Apply Post-Process Tone Mapping. Beautiful. If this is unfamiliar, take some time to orbit around the cube and try to understand why each dimension of position is the color that it is. Pick a point on the cube and think about what the 3D coordinate would be, and how this correlates to the color you see. Again, it's because we mapped the X, Y, Z coordinates to corresponding RGB values. Now let's move on to part 2, where we'll set up the gradient we'll use for the final color in our shader. We're going to need some room to work here. For controlling the gradient, I'm going to add a range node for each color channel. I'm also going to add a smooth step for each color channel. I prefer how the gradient looks when it's going through a smooth step because it appears more gradual since it eases out of the full black values and eases into the white values. As we work on our gradient, we're going to only utilize the Z output from our position data. This makes sense because ultimately we'll be using a one-dimensional distance value, that is, the distance from the camera to the geometry surface, to drive the color. You could pick X, Y, or Z, but Z makes the most sense to me since we're dealing with depth. Okay, so let's name our range and smooth step nodes. These two will both be utilizing the Z-axis positional data, and ultimately they'll control the red channel for the color. So I'll just throw in a Z to R as a suffix to remind myself. We can connect up the Z position of the separate 3 node that I've named vector 3 to floats through the range and smooth step nodes, and then into the combined 3 node that I've named floats to color 3. Now let's duplicate the setup for the green and the blue channels. You can duplicate the nodes you have selected if you hit Command D, and it'll keep your connections so the range and the smooth step come in already connected. Great, so now we have a nice black to white gradient along our Z-axis. But let's start working on the color. Now we're going to utilize the range nodes for each color to edit the gradient so it has something close to the Monterey color scheme. I'm going to focus on the blue first, so let's disconnect the red and green channels. I encourage you to play around with your own values and make something different, but here are the values that I chose and fit with the Monterey look. I don't want the blue to ever go to full black. I just want a very dark blue as the darkest color, so the out low is going to be 0.2. Okay, that looks good for now, so I'm going to move on to the green values. Let's connect it into the green channel and remove the blue information so we can focus on the green. Okay, so the green channel in my scenario is going to be responsible for moving the gradient from magenta to almost a pure white. So it needs to start later than the other channels. I'll have it start to have an effect at about 1/3 of the way down, so I have an in low value of 0.3, and I want to keep it spread out a bit, so I bumped up the in high to 1.3. Okay, so let's move on to the red values. Again, let's just solo it to red. I want the red to have an effect once we see some blue coming through, and then it will move us from blue to magenta. So it will start later than the blue, but earlier than the green. I'll go with 0.1 for the in low and 0.9 for the in high, but that looks a little too squished, so I'll actually bump that up to 1.1. Perfect. Now let's wire these all up again and see how it looks. Yep, pretty close. Now I'm going back through and I'm going to clamp the output values so that it doesn't go past 0 to 1. I also forgot to change the out high for the green channel. I don't want to go all the way to white. I want the brightest part of the gradient to be this nice warm pink. So I'm going to bring the out high value down to 0.8. And I think that's looking pretty good. Congrats, we have our gradient. In part 3, we'll be changing the setup so that instead of being tied to the Z position of the cube, the gradient is tied to how far the cube's surface is from the camera. First, in order to calculate the distance from the camera, we need to access the position of the camera. Luckily, there's a node for this, add the camera position node. And similar to how we had to transform the space of the cube's position information, we also have to transform the camera's position. So add another transform vector node. As before, set the camera node's space to model. Then in the transform node, set the from space to model and the to space to world. Great, so we have position of camera and the cube surface in the same space. Now to find the vector between these two positions, we can simply subtract the two vectors. So add a subtract node. This calculates the resultant vector. But what we want to find is the one-dimensional length or distance of that vector 3. This is called the magnitude, and luckily there's a node that calculates it for us. Because we set up our cube in a specific way to help us visualize the gradient from 0 to 1, we had perfect input values. But once we start working based on the distance from the camera, we'll be working with more unexpected input values. So I'm preemptively going to add a remap node so that we can remap our distance to make sense for our colors. If this doesn't make sense just yet, hold on for a second, you'll see what I mean. Alright, the moment of truth. Let's start using our distance instead of the z coordinate to drive the gradient. We lost our gradient, and now everything is just that maximum pink color. But if we move in closer, we can see that it's working, but only when we're really close. Let's add some copies of our cube so that we can get a better idea of the type of distance we might want to visualize. We're just going to keep duplicating and moving some cubes around to get a nice line. And I'm going to position the camera so that we're looking down the line from an oblique angle. Now let's go back to our material and return to editing our remap values to get the gradient to work at more reasonable distances. I'm just going to up the in high value, and it starts to make sense. And 7 looks like a good value for the size of this scene. Wow, isn't that satisfying? I can just sit here and move these cubes around all day. Maybe I'll make more in a grid so I can get a feel for how our shader looks with more depth. Nice, this is looking great. If this is your first custom shader, congratulations. I hope you're getting an appreciation for how fun it can be to play with shaders. Let's recap our process. We used the position values of the cube surface to drive colors on the cube. Then we modified how the channels are mixed so we could move from a black to white gradient to something more interesting. Lastly, we utilized the position data from the camera to find the distance from the camera to the cube surface and utilize this to drive the gradient. Hopefully you became a little more comfortable working with shaders, nodes, or Reality Composer Pro. And hopefully now you're thinking about all the other cool things you can make with shaders. And thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe, and if you appreciated this video or it inspired you to make something, hit me up on Twitter at Mr. Deerwell. Thanks!